Hello and welcome to week 6 of PUBH610. Today we will review health policy, and this is chapter 13 in your textbook. The learning objectives for this week are to review the definition, scope, and role of U.S. health policy, to review principal features of U.S. health policy and describe the legislative health policy process, to identify critical health policy issues in the United States, and to discuss the passage, implementation, and potential repeal of the ACA from a political perspective. The federal, state, and local government have long been involved in social welfare, healthcare, and health policy in the U.S. And as we discussed earlier in this semester, this involvement can be traced back to the alms and pest houses, which were the ancestors of modern-day hospitals. Over the years, the social programs in the United States have expanded, and under Franklin Roosevelt in the 1940s, amendments to the Social Security Act created massive federal public health insurance programs such as Medicare and Medicaid in 1965 and later CHIP in 1997. And recently, we all saw another major change in government health policy with the passage of the ACA in 2010. These policies provide the foundation for other tax-financed programs which support healthcare, such as the push for Medicare for All, which we're seeing today. So, what is health policy? First of all, public policies are authoritative decisions made in the legislative, executive, or judicial branch of government, and they're intended to direct or influence the actions, behaviors, or decisions of others. A health policy is the aggregate of principles, stated or unstated, that characterize the distribution of resources, services, and political influences that impact the health of the population. Public policies, as well as health policies, are designed and voted on by legislatures who are responsive to their constituents, aka the people who live in their district and have the power to vote them into or out of office. Therefore, while some policies may be designed with the benefit of all Americans in mind, more often than not, they're going to be responsive to the views or wishes of their own constituents. Health policies have two main uses. There are regulatory functions and there are allocative functions. Regulatory tools are used by government to control the behavior of a target group by monitoring the group and imposing sanctions if the group fails to comply. Examples of this include quality of care standards, which are outlined by Medicare. So for instance, if you don't meet the quality standards, then you won't get reimbursed by Medicare, or local Department of Health regulators, which assess the cleanliness of restaurants and then post ratings based on their findings. While some regulations are monitored by an organization or government body, such as those that I just listed, others are self-regulated, such as physicians who set standards for their own medical practice, or hospitals who accreditate other hospitals. Another example of this is how schools of public health decide which courses are required for Masters of Public Health programs. Allocative tools, on the other hand, involve the direct provision of income, services, or goods to certain people or groups of people or institutions. They can be either distributive, in that they spread benefits throughout society, such as funding for the NIH, or they can be redistributive and are designed to only benefit certain groups of people by taking money from one group and giving it to another. And Medicaid is an example of a redistributive policy. Health policies can affect individuals or groups of individuals, and some examples are licensing of physicians, Medicaid for the poor, Medicare for the elderly, and CHIP for children. Here are several features of U.S. health policy, many of which we've discussed before, such as the large role of the private sector in healthcare in the U.S. The fragmented nature of our policies, for example, different Medicaid funding comes from a combination of state and federal funds, and the fact that we have different Medicaid eligibility thresholds in different states. Another issue is our incremental and piecemeal policies, such as Medicare, which originally only included Parts A and B, and since then has gradually expanded to cover other benefits such as speech or physical therapy. And in the US, we also have strong interest groups, such as the American Medical Association, the AARP, and Big Pharma, which each have their own agendas and they lobby for those interests. Please see Exhibit 13-1 in your textbook, which is on page 544, for a list of key healthcare concerns for certain interest groups. For example, you'll see that health practitioners are very concerned with professional income maintenance, which makes sense. They don't want to make less money. Having professional autonomy, not having government oversee, closely what they're doing, and malpractice reform. Other features are the pluralistic suppliers of health policy. So, for example, how both the executive and legislative branches at the federal, state, and local levels can create health policies. And the theory of federalism really underpins the shared power between federal and state governments and is largely responsible for the decentralized role of states in health policy. But there are some arguments for increasing the role of states in health policy making, and some of those include the fact that Americans in general distrust centralized government, and in general, they lack faith in federal government as an administrator. It's also much easier to change a state law than a federal one, and states are more likely to take risks. State and local governments are also closer to their constituents, and therefore they're more in tune with what people in their own states want, and they're more likely to implement and enforce programs of their own making. And lastly, the president has an important role in health policy development given his or her influence in Congress and veto power. Health policy development is a complex process and one which involves the public and private sector as well as multiple levels of government. And in the next couple of slides, we'll discuss these aspects of the U.S. government and populace with a closer look at the policy cycle, the legislative committees, and the legislative process and policy implementation. The policy cycle includes these 5 components: issue raising, policy design, public support building, legislative decision making and policy support building, and legislative decision making and policy implementation. These activities are shared by Congress and interest groups in varying degrees depending on the issue. Issue raising is an important step. You need to create a widespread sense that there is a problem that needs to be addressed with a new policy. Cabinet members, advisors, and campaign information, as well as personal interests, expert opinions, and public opinion polls can all be sources which help the president form new policy ideas. Policy design is the second component of the policy cycle. When a president wants to design a new policy, they can call on internal segments of the executive branch, such as staff from the Center for Medicaid and Medicare, or they can seek input from external task forces. Public support building includes a variety of methods For instance, now Donald Trump uses Twitter to engage and energize his base. Presidents generally meet with their legislative leaders several mornings each month to shape the legislative agenda and to identify problems that a bill may face moving through the various committees. The fourth and fifth components of the policy cycle sit in the legislative branch, Congress, and we will discuss Congress in the next couple of slides. Congress has three important legislative powers. First, the Constitution grants Congress the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution. In other words, Congress can use any reasonable means to enact laws. Second, Congress has the power to tax, which means it can influence and regulate health behaviors of individuals, organizations, and states through taxation. For example, cigarette taxes decreased individual cigarette consumption, while tax breaks to employers who offer health insurance impacts all employees within that organization. Lastly, Congress has the power to allocate resources, aka they can spend money on public health through federal programs, such as giving more money to the NIH or to Medicare. And with allocating resources, Congress also has the power to attach strings to those resources. So for instance, in order to receive Medicaid funds in your state, you'll need to do X, Y, and Z. There are 14 committees and subcommittees in the House and 24 committees and subcommittees in the Senate. And there are more than 60 other legislative panels which directly influence legislation. But these 5 committees, 3 in the House and 2 in the Senate, are the most influential. First, the Ways and Means Committee in the House is influential because of its ability to tax. All bills that involve taxation must begin in the House of Representatives. And the Ways and Means Committee within the House is in charge of taxation. The Ways and Means Committee has sole jurisdiction over big government programs such as Medicare Part A, Social Security, unemployment benefits, public welfare, and healthcare reform. These are policies that will impact every single one of us. The Commerce Committee has power over Medicaid and Medicare Part B, as well as public health and mental health, health personnel, HMOs, food and drugs, air pollution, consumer product safety, health planning, biomedical research, and health protection. So you can see there are a lot of issues that they also have influence over. It makes them a very powerful committee. The Committee on Appropriations is responsible for funding substantial legislative provisions. This committee allocates money to individual health programs, except for Medicare and Social Security. In the Senate, the Committee on Labor and Human Resources has power over most health bills, including the Public Health Service Act, the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, and mental health legislation, etc. And then there's the Committee on Finance, which has a subcommittee on health and is similar to the Ways and Means Committee in the House. They have jurisdiction over taxes and revenues, including Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and Title X Act of the Social Security Act. I'm briefly describing the legislative process in today's lecture, but please also watch the video I posted on Blackboard, which describes the legislative process in greater detail, and it comes from congress.gov. I've posted the link to the overview of the legislative process, but you can also watch more in-depth clips on any of the policy-making steps that you may have questions about. And I hope you take the time to review this material because it will not only make you a better public health leader and manager, but also a more informed citizen. So in brief, a bill is introduced in the House. If it's approved, it moves along to the Senate. If it passes through the Senate, then it goes to the president, and if the president signs it, then it becomes a law. Once a policy has made it through all those steps and is signed into law, then we move into the policy implementation stage. The new law is forwarded to the appropriate agency of the executive branch, where multiple levels of federal bureaucracy must interpret and implement the legislation. Rules and regulations need to be written, and during this process, other politicians, interest groups, or sometimes program beneficiaries themselves can influence the ultimate design of the legislation. The proposed regulations are then published in the Federal Register, and there are hearings on how the legislation will be implemented. Then the program will go to the states for enabling legislation if necessary, and there local lawyers and lobbyists will begin a whole new policy cycle. And sometimes the legislation will wind up in court. The ACA provides a good example of health policy implementation. After the ACA was signed into law in 2010, 12 states decided to create state-based health insurance exchanges. 5 states opted for a state-based marketplace through a federal platform. 6 created state partnership marketplaces, and 28 states' health insurance exchanges were created by the federal government. So you can see how this was a federal policy, but the implementation was very different depending on which state you lived in. As we've discussed before, many health policies focus on access, cost, and quality of care. Here is a list of some of the priority groups that legislation has focused on to address access to care. For example, there's been federal funding for community health centers to ensure that healthcare services and providers are distributed across geographic regions. Regarding access and the elderly, there are serious debates about if Medicare spending should be restrained to keep the program viable, that the program is not adequately focused on the management of chronic conditions, and that the program doesn't pay for long-term nursing care, which many elderly people will need. Please read the articles by Ettazzoni and Callahan, which I've posted to Blackboard, and share on the discussion board whose argument you agree with. As we discussed last week, the costs of healthcare have grown in the United States, and as a result, no other aspect of healthcare policy has received more attention in the past 30 years. Some of the most critical policy issues are the increase in prescription drug costs, which increased 12% in 2014 and 2015, the largest increase in more than 10 years. This increase has been driven by brand name entries into the market and price increases for generic drugs. Manufacturers claim that these high prices are justified by research and development costs. One of the most famous examples of this problem is the EpiPen. Mylan increased the price of the EpiPen from $100 to $600 in 2016. But no government action has been taken to prevent price hiking, and therefore the prices may continue to rise. As we discussed last week, quality of care should be improved along these 6 areas, which were outlined in the famous article, Crossing the Quality Chasm, it's really a report, from the Institute of Medicine, which was published in 2001. There has been an increase in funding to research quality of care and measure the outcomes of medical interventions. There's also been malpractice reform. In 1986, there was the Health Care Quality Act, which created a national database within DHHS to provide legal actions against health providers. So when you're recruiting physicians from other states, you can see if they have any actions against them. More recently, some states have limited the damage awards in malpractice cases, but there's not a uniform national law regarding malpractice. The research community influences policy development through these three ways: documentation, analysis, and prescription. Documentation refers to the gathering, cataloging, and correlating facts, and it may help to define a public health policy problem. Second, analysis, such as demonstration projects on things like feasibility or the efficacy of a policy, can be helpful in policy development. And third, research which shows a certain policy may or may not lead to an undesirable outcome can contribute to whether or not this policy is adopted or spread. Other critical policy issues and future considerations for health policy are, if you've watched the news recently, you know that there are many critical policy issues that are related to our domestic health policy, such as, will we succeed in passing Medicare for all? We don't know. We're going to have to wait and see. There have also been several initiatives to expand access to primary care and to evaluate different service delivery models. And on the international front, our government spending has stayed relatively stable. Even President Trump reauthorized funding for huge global health initiatives such as PEPFAR. But he also reinstated the Mexico City policy, also known as the Global Gag Rule, which bans foreign NGOs from performing or promoting abortion if they want to receive any U.S. funding. This policy was first enacted by Reagan in 1984 and has been in place for 17 of the last 32 years. This policy hinders women's access to needed sexual and reproductive health care and hopefully will be overturned in the next administration. In summary, the process of turning a policy into law is very complex, and many interest groups are involved and can block or alter the policy and how it's implemented. But health policies are developed to serve the public's interest, and the passage of the ACA couldn't have happened without strong leadership from President Obama. We still have a lot of work to do to solve issues around access, cost, and quality of healthcare in the United States. But rather than get too frustrated, just remember that this makes health policy in the U.S. a dynamic field, desperately in need of people like you who have expertise in public health leadership and management. Please check out Blackboard for the additional readings and materials that I've posted there, and I'll talk to you next week.